welcome back, everybody. It's great to have you back with us here on Frontlines and Faultlines. So today I'm going to talk to you about some fairly dark subject matter, and it sometimes reminds me of two themes. One is the Alice in Wonderland stuff from Through the Looking Glass, particularly. At times these days we're being told black is white and the obverse of what reality or facts are. And of course, there are a few interesting lines from Alice in Wonderland where Humpty Dumpty's conversing with Alice and says, words will mean whatever I choose them to mean. And Alice says, well, how can words have so many meanings? And Humpty Dumpty's response is, that is not the question. The question is, who is to be master? That's all. It's a bit like that at the moment at times, where people tell you one thing one day and something else the next. And then, of course, the other factor being that there's a great big game of chess going on in the world at the moment of critical foreign actors that are part of this issue. And that is also the famous line from Alice where she says, sometimes I think the world's just one big game of chess, if this is really the world at all, And then, of course, for those more modern context people watching this who are fans of The Matrix, you'll understand the objective there was to exercise mind control, to create a slavery of the mind of people. And that is really the objective of some of these autocratic threats we face in the world today. The problem we face with information warfare and how it is corroding our societies and corroding the basis on which we make decisions, potentially, particularly in liberal democracies. So with that kind of unfortunate backset, I want to point out to all of you what is, to my mind, the critical factor here, and that is the corrosion of democracy. Now, there are two institutions that have done a lot of research on this and have been doing that research for many decades. The first is the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, which is based in Stockholm. And they've tracked that and they've analysed over 158 countries since 1975. But effectively, they said that over the past 5 years, they've tracked a 47% decline in democratic indicators in the countries that they survey. And that is, 8 years in a row that has happened since they began doing those surveys. Interestingly, too, in all of those constituencies where there is voluntary voting, there's been a substantial drop-off over these last years from 2008 to now of 10%. So it's dropped from 65% participation to 55% in those jurisdictions with voluntary voting. And one of those issues relates to this disinformation story that I want to talk to you about, but also there are other factors such as government intimidation and foreign interference. But also, when we talk about disinformation, we start talking about the acceleration that artificial intelligence has caused in that realm. So that's the issue that's been surfaced by the IADEA from Stockholm. The next most disturbing statistic, though, that I want to surface to you is the VDEM Institute at the University of Gothenburg, again in Sweden. Again, decades worth of research looking at the health of democracies and the world in general, have tracked that in the last 10 years, we've gone from 48% of the world's population living in autocracies to, as of this date, 71% of the world's population living in autocracies, 5.8 billion of our 8 billion people. That is deeply disturbing. And in addition to that, only 13% of the world now lives in a liberal democracy. So we're in a shrinking minority. And we need to stand up and do something about that. Now, I'm not saying all of that is caused by misinformation, but a great deal of it is. And it's important to know the history of that. And we'll do a couple of programs on this, and we'll be talking with Michael Jensen further about the current state of affairs, but the history is important to understand. And one of the countries that's been very significant in all of this has been Russia. They have a long history going back to the Tsarist Imperial Russian intelligence services, who created back in 1903 the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And that may categorize as one of the most successful misinformation pieces in the entire history of this subject, because it continues to operate in effect today and has been fallen back on many times and is reflected almost word for word in things like the Hamas covenant, for example. But so going from the checker and GPU through to the KGB to today in Russia is a very informative exercise. And the use of those propaganda subversion methods really evolved in the sorts of objectives and the sorts of techniques that we used. And how do we know so much about this? Well, in the first case, we've had good information coming from defectors from the Soviet Union or the Soviet Union's satellite network. So a guy named Ladislav Bittman defected from the USSR in 1968 and ended up writing a book called The Deception Game in 1972. And in that book, he described how they'd evolved their doctrine and their approaches to this. And a few key points emerged from it. So they analysed it and said that at first, the first principle is that you have to have your misinformation based at least partially as a response to reality, or at least accepted views, to build on those, to exploit them, exploit fault lines, to borrow a word from our title. And he indicated that more than 10,000 disinformation operations had occurred during the height of the Cold War in that period. 10,000. And but it particularly began in earnest in the 1920s, and it was a bit haphazard at first and experimental. But then after World War II, it really started to become very professionalised and focused. And in effect, actually, the US kind of led the way immediately after World War II, and we'll come back to that. But then they drifted away from it after 1960, while the USSR drew all the lessons out of it, what had been learned till that point, and then greatly amplified and ramped up their effort. So initially you had people like Felix Dzerzhinsky, who headed the Checker, and then one of his acolytes, Artur Tuzov, who formed the Office of Disinformation in 1923. And just a couple of examples of the sorts of activities they were involved in was one was the manipulation of the white Russian emigres who were based in other European countries. They were worried about them fomenting counter-revolution back in Russia in the fragile early days of the Soviet Union. So they created a thing called Operation Trust, where they created disinformation flowing through to those emigres to encourage them to come back to meet with people, and then they'd seize them, and usually it ended up executed, or feeding false information through their networks internationally to undermine and degrade those activities. Another interesting operation of theirs was the false Japanese Mein Kampf, which was a completely fabricated production of their intelligence services to try and convince the West of what the real intentions of the Japanese imperial authorities were at the time, and to help mobilize activities against them. It was complete fabrication. Another one was in New York in 1930, where the New York Police Department fabricated a document which indicated that the Soviet Union was interfering and orchestrating labor unrest at the time in the context of the Great Depression, and it was a completely fabricated production. But really, you start to see a lot of things happening out of West and East Germany after the Second World War. And there were West German groups like Kampfgruppe and the US group LC Kasich, which really got heavily into this misinformation game that was being played between East and West Germany and the Soviets and NATO. And there were all sorts of activities like false biographies and leaks that were fed to journalists. And we will hear from Michael Jensen to explain how they exploited the AIDS issue into the 80s, and then how in those times and up to date, how peace movements also have been a source of exploitation for them. Of course, obviously the Cold War was a big accelerator, and the US approach to misinformation after the Second World War was quite intense for a while there. It included manufacturing material for jazz magazines and women's magazines, quite an active effort. But after a while, it sort of fell out of favour. There was a lot of disdain in the intelligence services in America in regard to misinformation. They were more interested in traditional espionage and more direct methods of achieving objectives and surveillance activities, etc., technical or otherwise. But the Soviets continued to develop and evolve their capabilities, and the hubs became particularly Czechoslovakia and East Germany, in that effort as complementary to the Soviet capabilities. And then we came to understand more about all of this because after 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down, we got access to all their files and materials in East Germany and Czechoslovakia, and to a degree even from the Soviet Union. But of course, the other factor that happened in relation to the US's withdrawal from this activity was from the Vietnam War period on. There tended to be more regulation of their intelligence services and more focus on preventing them from undermining, I guess, free media, etc. So the field was kind of left to the Soviets. Then, of course, you had a lot of resources thrown at that in the Soviet Union. So it was a very capable gentleman by the name of Wagner Group, who was expert in the field of about 7 languages, but cultures as well. And he would conduct experiments in Russia to test his misinformation activities. They effectively also grew their operational capability, growing from about 50 specialists to 20,000 by 1962. And then it became from Department D to the Service A mechanism. And they were running about 400 operations per year during that time. So that satellite world of the Soviet Union was a great amplifier of their activities, but the real expertise, as mentioned, was East Germany and Czechoslovakia. And one of the techniques that they learned was how to use Western journalists. And a guy named Rolf Wagenbreth from the East German Stasi said that what would active measures be without the journalist? And effectively, journalists in the West would be hungry for leaks and to get scoops, and so they exploited that dynamic. Later on, of course, there would be a whole new dimension to this with technology. So one of the interesting early experiments, this is the Soviet Union falling back on their experience of learning the benefits of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, was an anti-Semitism campaign that they initiated in Germany at Christmas 1959. So what they were looking to do there was to sow this perception that West Germany was still Nazified, that it shouldn't be supported by the West, and to undermine NATO and promote division within the alliance. And so they thought through this they could also maybe even destabilise and sow social discohesion in many Western countries. So they resurfaced the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and they mobilised KGB operatives internationally and sort of got within far-right groups and got them retargeted back on the Jewish communities in their countries and forged a bunch of documents, etc. But they also conducted graffiti actions. So you'll see here a picture of the synagogue in Cologne. And so Christmas 1959, the recently renovated, restored Cologne synagogue by West German government was smeared with these anti-Semitic graffiti incidents. And so that then was replicated in New York and other places around the world through KGB operatives. It succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. It really was picked up massively around the world through elements that were essentially anti-Semitic in the first place, or people who were happy to go along with it and fell into those tropes and the misinformation associated with it. Essentially, too, it demonstrated how easy it was in those days when there was no television and hard to communicate effectively countermeasures to these things. But what helped, of course, was the Eichmann trial in 1961, when people were acquiring televisions and you could tell the whole story of the Holocaust and understand the dynamics of anti-Semitism better. And so that campaign fizzled out in the end, but it certainly did for a while gain a lot of traction. And again, the KGB in this era learned a lot of lessons from it. Then, of course, to fast forward to modern times, we have the KGB then, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, morphing into the FSB, which is the Russian equivalent to our ASIO, the GRU, which is their military intelligence organization, and the SVR, which is their foreign intelligence service. Complementing that kind of galaxy and landscape was the formation of private military corporations, such as the Wagner Group, which was named in tribute to the Nazis by their founder, Dmitry Utkin, who was a big Nazi fan who actually had SS tattoos, etc. So they built capabilities in St. Petersburg particularly to be able to really operationalize their active measures, doctrine and strategies. So the Special Technology Center to develop the algorithms and the fake materials, the AI materials these days that were necessary to volumize, and then through their Internet Research Agency and bot factories to do that volumization. And they also later built connections with East European organized crime groups, etc., to help increase that volumization. And then you had people like Edward Snowden defecting to Russia in 2013, taking with him some technical techniques as well to enable them to accelerate their operations in that area. So you will have a greater unpacking of some of this, but one of the great examples has been the experience of Cambridge Analytica. It's a group ostensibly based in the UK that was seeking to exploit the personal data that existed in the social media world for the benefit of political operations. However, they were very much hand in glove with the Russian authorities. A lot of their funding came from the Russian Alpha Bank, and I think technical assistance, it would seem, as well. So they were obviously heavily involved in Brexit, which from the Russian point of view is a great way to undermine the EU. And then the 2016 US election, where Russian misinformation and active measures campaigns were run over a number of years in the lead up to that election. And there's a 4-volume US Senate Intelligence Committee report that really does cover a lot of this. But it is a real thing, and it had a great effect in that election. In fact, there was an alignment of the social media companies, Cambridge Analytica and the Trump election campaign team, who got together in one office building in San Antonio, conducting what they called Project Alamo, because San Antonio is where the Alamo is. So they were able to get 5,000 data points on every single US voter, and they were able to then target what they call the persuadables based in the key battleground states. And at the end of the day, all they really needed was 70,000 of those people to achieve their effect. Incredibly successful operation. Now, after, of course, the Soviet Union era and the developments of all these techniques, it all comes back to the fact that President Putin was an ex-KGB colonel, and he just adopted all of those techniques to achieve personal power in Russia, and it's been a long campaign. But also to then resuscitate some of those techniques in the field that had become a little bit moribund. So the so-called residentura, which are the Russian operatives who exist in the United States, a lot of their social media activities are conducted in places like the New York Library, etc., where they volumize this stuff, or in particular learn what are the fault lines, what are the opportunities to exploit in that American context. But this is something that they look to now in every liberal democracy. What are the fault lines? What are the opportunities that we can exploit to create division? And journalists were still important to all of this, but and reporters still are very active in repeating or reporting on stuff. We've seen it time and time again. We'll unpack some of this in talking with Michael Jensen. It's perfect for doing it from an anonymous background. And basically you've seen organizations operating in the shadows, like, in fact, the shadow brokers and anonymous groups like the Guy Fawkes masks from V for Vendetta. You might have seen on the news or time to time reported on the Cyber Caliphate. All of these organizations are actually fronts for just Russian active measures activities. And so these groups were responsible also for hacking the Democratic National Convention's emails, which we used against Hillary Clinton in 2016. Those emails being provided to the willing partner of Russian intelligence at that time, Julian Assange, who would do interviews on RT and recycle some of the deeper conspiracy tropes that the campaigns were circulating then. For example, the death of the Democratic staffer and the conspiracy theories around that. Julian Assange helped to promote those theories. So it was a really disturbing concerted effort. And some of that stuff that was circulating at the time, and this is an example of a Russian fake posting, creating, a false identity of the army of Jesus, saying, Satan, if I win, Clinton wins, with Jesus responding, not if I can help it, and press like to help Jesus win. So this is just one example of multiple efforts done by Russian intelligence agents to volumize this theme. Another example was you pick on sensitivities that might matter to your target audience. And this is a fake identity. Pamela Moore was supposed to be a conservative Texas persona, completely created in St. Petersburg, but sending this line of, I'd rather take care of 10 homeless US veterans than 50,000 migrants. We're misspending our money on migrants and refugees, etc., when we should be focusing on our veterans. And quite often there'll be, as I mentioned before, always some element of truth, some aspect of reality that they'll try and uplift into this space to seek to achieve their objectives. In modern times too, the Russians have been very active across Central Africa, mainly through the Wagner Group, and they've been running in association with that extensive information campaigns where they will portray the West as the old colonial club. What we want to see is a world where we have multipolarity, not hegemonies of the old white club. And that in that multipolar world, you will have, you will get your day in the sun and you will have a better life. And don't trust Western medicine or their aid materials, et cetera, et cetera. And in the context of that, they've also been supporting and enabling and in fact conducting coups, mass rapes, mass murder, and in fact in Sudan, genocides. So in Sudan, of course, you're getting Russia aligned with Iran in that effort. And it's not the only place. So effectively, these private military corporations now working right across the Middle East, Africa, they're in the Ukraine, and particularly in places like Mali, Burkina Faso, Central African Republic, Niger, Libya, and Sudan. In Sudan, we've seen now 11 million people displaced and over 150,000 civilians killed, and mass rape in an actual genocide, and huge swathes of the Sudanese population at risk from famine, and chemical weapons by the Russians now being deployed in Sudan as we speak. Just as they did in Syria, which caused so many brutal deaths and thousands upon thousands of casualties over all the years of that Syrian conflict, probably 500,000 people. So, it's been a horrendous effect, but also it's been a means by which Russia, for example, bypasses sanctions. So they've earned $1 billion a year from their Sudanese engagement alone. But $2 billion altogether from things like timber and diamonds across Central Africa. Of course, now since the Prigozhin and Utkin were killed by Putin, Wagner Group is now being called the Africa Corps in Africa, I guess maintaining that Nazi link. And they're now directly under the control of the GRU 29155 branch, which handles assassination and destabilization. So associated with all of this too in this modern world has been organised crime and the Russian oligarchs. Through the privatization opportunity that was offered in Russia, you had the rise of these oligarchs, and Putin then had a perfect opportunity to suborn them and be another arm of his efforts, but also with plausible deniability, but vast financial resources associated with them, and also the Russian mafia, or as it's known as the Bratva, the Brotherhood, and a key figure in that being Simeon Mogilevich, who was very active in making sure that Trump was financially aided through his bankruptcy period, for example, in return getting the availability of the Trump Tower network to launder Russian mafia money internationally. So this is, I guess, what that complex spider web looks like on the Russian side of things now. Don't worry, you're not going to be tested on this, but it just gives you the idea of the dimensions of it. The Russian oligarch arm on the left-hand side there, the African operations, which are effectively under the control of the GRU. These private military organisations don't only involve the ex-Wagner Group now, but also Redut and Convoy. And you can see how all of this works together to be complementary to Russian objectives. And these are the places that the private military corporations in Russia, or the Russian corporations, are either active in or seeking to expand their operations in. And Africa has been their main fertile ground because it offers a lot of financial opportunity. So basically, I'd like to emphasize that in our current times, this is really a product and a factor of what I call a rectangle of rat bags. Russia, Iran, China, and North Korea are now becoming much more closely aligned, cooperating much more closely, and obviously been forced in on each other a fair bit because of conflicts like the war in the Ukraine and the war in the Middle East, sanctions regimes, etc., mutual interest, a lot of it. And now they're coordinating their misinformation operations. So since 2016, other countries like Iran, China, and North Korea suddenly woke up and said, hey, look what the Russians achieved for very little expenditure, and realized they could really work together to amplify that effect. So the Iranians, Press TV, Hispan TV, Xinhua, and the other Chinese platforms, and RT and Doppelganger and Telegram in the Russian universe. All of these things are as partly legacy media, partly new media, helping to volumize their themes, their objectives across particularly the developing world in Asia, Latin America, and also Africa, but also in parts of Europe and the US. And the Chinese alone are investing upwards of $10 billion on their international media effort. And they've been getting a lot of traction in the developing world because they offer a good polished product, but at far cheaper prices than Western media outlets. And this enables them to be complementary with their social media activities as well. So this is the way they perpetrate or perpetuate these themes of the multipolar world they want to create. Now, there's two particular objectives that they're all aligned on at the moment. One is for your own domestic population, you're trying to basically switch them off, dissuade them from thinking that life is better in the West or that they could have a better life where they are. So to prevent revolutions or attempts at regime change in their own countries. And then the flip side of that, to exploit these opportunities in the West for bringing down a potential opponent. And their themes in their own countries will be along the lines of, the West is degenerate, they're going to take away your kids and give them to gay couples. There's race conflict there, there's economic breakdown, it's just a mess, you wouldn't want to be there. So those are the themes they try and portray on a relentless basis on their outlets. But what we're beginning to see is too, because they've created distrust of media, in some sectors, they don't mind if you don't actually believe some of their stuff, as long as also they're achieving this goal of promoting skepticism or confusion or apathy in the West, then they're also partly achieving their goal. Also, I guess a good example recently that we're seeing in Australia, which has been less vulnerable because we have mandatory voting and there haven't been really big obvious fault lines. The Middle East conflict has offered an opportunity there to actually engage heavily, and particularly targeting what we call the progressive side of society. And because you have polarization these days with algorithms reinforcing your self-confirming bias, and you get into an interest group, you can use that interest group to make sure everything is promulgated for you by those groups. And you can see this play out in the unrest we've seen on uni campuses. Demonstrations that often began with some people involved for the best of intentions, wanting peace, wanting a ceasefire. Then it be morphing into actually calling for a wider war, for the actual defeat and total annihilation of the state of Israel and the death of all of its Jews. And then morphing into calls for boycotts of any dealings with Israeli businesses by universities, and then finally to boycott any involvement with even national companies that might be involved in your own national security efforts. So then you have to ask yourself who benefits from that. At the moment, we still have a technological edge over Russia, certainly, but less so, but still there over China, but under constant threat. And who does it benefit to switch off our efforts to maintain that technological edge? So their interests then aligning based on a current issue where there might be some genuine interest there in wanting to stop a war, etc., and exploiting that. So, we've also had Russian interference and Iranian interference in the recent US election. Of course, there were other factors at play in the recent US election, so it wasn't as, central to the result as it was in 2016. But you can also see some of the techniques emerging, like when President Trump claimed that the refugees or immigrants were eating cats and dogs in the town of in the Midwest there in the US of Springfield. And in reality, of course, they weren't, but people were putting forward images on there in social media. For example, this gentleman holding a bird, claiming he was one of these people who's grabbing pets, wildlife, etc., and eating it. And in effect, this gentleman had picked up a bird who'd been injured on the side of the road, and he wasn't anywhere near Springfield. So that's the way it works. In Gaza, a really good example where our own ABC had to apologise was a video clip of a row of bodies in these body bags or shrouds. And it was said to have come from the war in Gaza. In reality, this is footage and a picture of Egyptian students protesting 10 years ago in Egypt. And if you rolled the video forward, you would see one of these bodies sitting up and talking to the cameraman. So the ABC aired this as facts coming from Gaza and then eventually had to apologise for it. So this is the crossover that we're getting where legacy media is vulnerable to social media. And in the 2020 election, you saw the fight back starting to happen in the US where the Attorney General there, Merrick Garland, went after some of these activities that they've criminalised and were criminal and tried to arrest or cease, shut down and fine firms that cooperating with Russian operations to create and distribute content that had been under this Russian information operation campaign, and in particular through people like Margarita Simonyan, who's one of the 10 people who've been sanctioned under the Magnitsky legislation there for attempts to harm public trust in their institutions. So, a lot of people have been charged and dealt with under that regime. It's been the attempt to fight back. And there's a lot of detail in that, which we might be able to go into as we talk more about these things in the months and programs ahead. One of the things I want to really seriously focus on as we go forward in these programs is the unfortunate deterioration and decline of the United Nations in this context. I spent a good part of my life, as I talked about in the introduction to our program, in fighting for the improvement and the benefit and the assistance of the United Nations as an institution. But that information I surfaced to you about the rise of autocracies has had its effect on the UN. So when the Russian delegate stands up and talks, he doesn't talk on behalf of 1.4 billion Chinese. He talks on behalf of one person, Xi Jinping. When the Russian delegate stands up, he doesn't talk on behalf of 140 million Russians. He talks on behalf of one person, Vladimir Putin. And so with this 71% of the world living under autocracies, that has now affected and infected the UN mechanisms and turned the UN into, in many ways, a clearinghouse for their information warfare themes, to sanitize and legitimize their regimes, to manipulate the developing world, deprioritize the genuine fight for human rights, where today you'll see the Saudi Arabians on the council for, or chairing the council for women's rights, which is absurd. It would as absurd as Iran doing that as well. And of course, Russia and China still have the veto power on the Security Council as well. So now all of UN institutions are starting to suffer from this. The types of resolutions that are produced contain a lot of half-truths, flat-out lies and disinformation. And their activities are obscenely skewed to overwhelming focus on certain issues such as Israel, which is an incredible disproportion to all of the array of threats and challenges and human rights issues in the world today. Now, there are things that I'd encourage you all to do as parents or as young adults, to really take an interest in your education and the education of your kids. Make sure that your schools are tackling the issue of equipping them with critical thought capability and techniques, and also the ability to evaluate sources properly. There are technical measures that are underway under the Department of Advanced Research projects and opportunities in the United States, which are looking to tackle some of the technical aspects of this, and we'll talk more about that. But we have a lot of work to do, and I think the government needs to take up a lot more rigorous approach to public awareness campaigns and surfacing and exposing misinformation when it happens. There are a lot of regulatory and privacy issues can be associated with this, freedom of speech issues, but if we can technically establish the underpinnings of misinformation campaigns and credibly convey that message, then we will be doing a lot of good in fighting back. But it's also about the conversations we have amongst each other, and hopefully a program like this will help inform people better as they try to unpack the context of circumstances that are plaguing the world right now, and hopefully in the future we'll take each issue as we find it and give you the background and context to it and with as accurate and factual a basis as we possibly can. So that's it for this program. Hope to be with you again soon, and then we'll move on to talk about some of the more current conflicts and contexts of all of this. So thank you very much.